you. Hare Krishna.
Anyone else? Okay. Idam, this Bhagavatam, book containing the narration of the personality of Godhead and his pure devotees. Nama, of the name. Puranam, supplementary to the Vedas. Brahma Samhitam, incarnation of Lord Sri Krishna. Uttama Shloka, of the personality of Godhead. Charitam, activities. Ara, compiled. Bhagavan, incarnation of the personality of Godhead. Rishihi, Sri Vyasadeva. Nishrayasaya, for the ultimate good. Lokasya, of all people. Dhanyam, fully successful. Svasti ayanam, all blissful. Mahat, all perfect. Translation. This Srimad Bhagavatam is the literary incarnation of God, and it is compiled by Srila Vyasadeva, the incarnation of God. It is meant for the ultimate good of all people, and it is all successful, all blissful, and all perfect. Purport by Srila Prabhupada. So first I'll read through the entire purport, and then I'll go through line by line and comment. Lord Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu declared that Srimad Bhagavatam is the spotless sound representation of all Vedic knowledge and history. There are selected histories of great devotees who are in direct contact with the personality of Godhead. Srimad Bhagavatam is the literary incarnation of Lord Sri Krishna and is therefore non-different from him. Srimad Bhagavatam should be worshipped as respectfully as we worship the Lord. Thereby we can derive the ultimate blessings of the Lord through its careful and patient study. As God is all light, all bliss, and all perfection, so also is Srimad Bhagavatam. We can have all the transcendental light of the Supreme Brahman, Sri Krishna, from the recitation of Srimad Bhagavatam, provided it is received through the medium of the transparent spiritual master. Lord Chaitanya's private secretary, Srila Swarup Damodar Goswami, advised all intending visitors who came to see the Lord at Puri to make a study of Bhagavatam from the person Bhagavatam. Person Bhagavatam is the self-realized bona fide spiritual master, and through him only can one understand the lessons of the Bhagavatam, the book Bhagavatam, in order to receive the desired result. One can derive from the study of the Bhagavatam all benefits that are possible to be derived from the personal presence of the Lord. It carries with it all the transcendental blessings of Lord Sri Krishna that we can expect from his personal contact. Again, the translation. This Srimad Bhagavatam is the literary incarnation of God, and it is compiled by Srila Vyasadeva, the incarnation of God. It is meant for the ultimate good of all people, and it is all successful, all blissful, and all perfect. Joy. Okay, so I'm going to start out by going through this purport. Now, I also want to compare this to Srimad Bhagavatam 112. I refer to this verse a lot, and it's an important verse to remember. I remember when I was a young aspiring devotee, um, we used to have, I guess they still do, I don't know if they're doing it this year, but every year at Gita Nagari over Memorial Day weekend and Labor Day weekend, since they're long weekends, there would be seminars. And different devotees would come from different parts of the world, and they would give classes on different subject matters. So, one Prabhu would come and he would teach Sanskrit. Another devotee would come and he would, talk about a specific portion of the Bhagavatam. Yeah, another would talk about deity worship, like that. So there would be all these different, whatever you're attracted to in Krishna consciousness, there would be some sort of seminar there. So all these different speakers coming, and they do a similar thing at New Vrindavan called the Festival of Inspiration. These are really, nice ways to immerse yourself in bhakti. Anyway, one of these weekend retreats, seminars that I went to, my guru was giving class on Srimad Bhagavatam 112. Now, the previous seminar, he gave class on Srimad Bhagavatam 111 for an entire week. He just talked on the one verse for an entire week, but I missed that one. I didn't live at the temple at that time. But so when he went and did the one for 112 for the entire week, I was there, and he said he could of course speak on that verse for a month or more, but a week was very enlightening. The reason why 112 is so important for us is because it gives us the purpose of Srimad Bhagavatam. And it's important for us to keep this in mind when we study Srimad Bhagavatam, what the Bhagavatam's purpose is, so we don't lose sight. Today's verse, Srila Prabhupada mentioned in his purport, that not only do we study Srimad Bhagavatam, but he says through its careful and patient study. So it's not just, Srila Prabhupada is always very careful to point out how we are to approach Krishna consciousness. And it's just not in a whimsical way or a haphazard way. It's in a very careful and patient and conscious, very mindful way, so that we can fully understand what's going on. And so in Srimad Bhagavatam 112, which is a lot like this verse. So this verse today, it's talking about the ultimate good for all people. In Srimad Bhagavatam 112, let's see, Shivadam Tapatra Mulanam. Shivadam means ultimate good of all people also, and it gets rid of the threefold miseries. And then, all successful, all blissful, all perfect. So the one thing I want to point out from 112 today, before we start talking about today's purport, is in Srimad Bhagavatam 112, which it's Dharma Projita Kaitava Paramo Nirvatsaranam Satam Vedyam Vastavam Atra Vastu Shivadam Tapa Trayun Mulanam Srimad Bhagavate Mahamunikate Kim Vapra Ishvara Sadhyo Hridyavarujate Trakriti Vishu Shrishubis Takshanat. In this verse, there's this word vastu, and vastu means substance, something substantial. Now, even in the English language, the word substance, it means more than just one word. You can't really describe what substance is without really describing it. So substance is basically it's something that's real, something substantial. The most common use of substance or substantial in the English language is like, say we're talking about a substantial meal. It would have to be a complete meal. It couldn't just be like a snack. It would have to, be substantial. But the actual word substance, it doesn't just mean complete. It actually means real. And then we actually, in order to understand what substance is, we sort of have to understand what it's also not. And so what there is there's substance, which is reality, and then there's shadow, which is It's based on that reality, and it looks a lot like that reality and is often mistaken for that reality. Because, if you cast a light on something and then it casts a shadow, we can see the silhouette, we can see the full shape, we can understand what's going on with it. But it's still just a shadow. It's not the original, it's not reality. And so in verse 112, this word vastu is there, and it just means substance. But the way Srila Prabhupada expands it in his translation is that it's distinguishing illusion or reality from illusion. And that's really you can't really just say, this Bhagavatam describes reality. You could say that, but it wouldn't be the full picture. You wouldn't understand that that there's also something that looks a lot like reality, but it's not. We could say that, and we can even understand it just talking amongst ourselves. But Srila Prabhupada expands this to show what it really means, so we don't overlook it, so we don't miss it. And this is what the Bhagavatam is all about. It's the highest truth is reality distinguished from illusion for the welfare of all. So being able to understand what is real and what is not, that is the goal of the Srimad Bhagavatam, and that should always be our mindset in studying it. When we read through Srimad Bhagavatam, as Srila Prabhupada says, carefully and patiently, we should always have this in mind: is how the verses of Srimad Bhagavatam can help us determine what is actually real, what is substantial, what is substance, and then what is just a shadow of it. Because again, the shadow, since it's based on the substance, it can look a lot like it, and we can mistake the illusion for reality if we don't really fully understand what's going on. And this is Srimad Bhagavatam's purpose. This is it's meant to shed light for the aspiring devotees on what is actually real and what is actually illusion, so that we can properly make progress on the spiritual path. So I'm just going to go through the purport a little bit here. Lord Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu declared that Srimad Bhagavatam is the spotless sound representation of all Vedic knowledge and history. There are selected histories of great devotees who are in direct contact with the personality of Godhead. Srimad Bhagavatam is the literary incarnation of Lord Sri Krishna and is therefore non-different from him. This sentence is very important to understand. Srila Vyasadeva compiled the Bhagavat Purana, the Srimad Bhagavatam, in his maturity, when he understood that after compiling all the Vedas, which were meant for all different grades of human beings, and the Vedas is meant to elevate people from whatever consciousness they're currently in to God consciousness. So Srila Vyasadeva, he had a daunting task ahead of him, because if you look at all of humanity and think, okay, from the lowest to the highest, and how can I elevate all of them into consciousness? So obviously he compiled a lot of literatures that would appeal to each of these different grades of personalities. And so as he did that, and again, they're all meant to bring these different personalities from whatever consciousness they're at to God consciousness. And so there's a lot in there that is just pertinent to particular classes of men, and not necessarily pertinent to anyone else. And so he did that, and even though all the Vedas have the same aim, to bring one toward Krishna consciousness, they're all presented in a very different way. And so after Srila Vyasadeva did this, even though he did his service very well, he felt despondent. He felt that there was still something left for him to do, that he didn't quite feel satisfied in himself that he's bringing everyone to this Krishna consciousness, which is the goal of all Vedas. And so he, like any good aspiring Vaishnava, when dealing with confusion or dissatisfaction, he went to a spiritual master. Of course, he inquired from his spiritual master, and he said, hey, I'm feeling despondent, I'm feeling dissatisfied, I'm doing my service, but I still don't feel like I've quite done it perfectly yet. And so Narad Muni said to him, his guru, he said, well, you've described how to come from all these different levels of consciousness to Krishna consciousness, but you've done it in such a way, and obviously rightfully so, that people could get distracted by the facilities that you've allowed them in order to elevate their consciousness. They could be distracted by those material facilities, and therefore that's why you're not feeling completely satisfied. So what you need to do is now write a Purana that is just for aspiring devotees. So there's different levels of consciousness of human beings, right? And they're all meant to come to Krishna consciousness. Now, how about for the ones who are already convinced, okay, I just want to serve Krishna. Now you write them a Purana, and that'll be the Bhagavad Purana. And all it will tell you is how to serve Krishna. It won't deal with any other subject matter. It doesn't, because people have already come to that conclusion. So you compile that book, and then you will feel completely satisfied. Just focus on service of Krishna. And so Srila Vyasadeva did that. And this is what Srimad Bhagavatam is. It is just focusing on Krishna Bhakti. It distinguishes what is reality and what is illusion. And it's for the benefit of everyone. All right. And so these are the parallels between 112 and then today's verse. Now, next line. This is also a very important line. Srimad Bhagavatam should be worshipped as respectfully as we worship the Lord. Now, since the Lord is not different from his form, Srimad Bhagavatam is not different from him, as we learned in the previous sentence, we should also worship Srimad Bhagavatam as respectfully as we worship the Lord. So, in other words, it's not just another book. We don't just, toss it around. We don't set it on the floor. We make sure we wash our hands before we touch it. Even when we had Bhagavat Commune had we called it a Srimad Bhagavatam Mahotsava. For 24 hours, we went through the 12 cantos of Bhagavatam. We summarized it. We had different senior devotees come from different parts of North America, and they would take either a canto or parts of a canto and give a summary. And so we talked about we went through the whole Bhagavatam, summarized it. But before we did that, we had Mother Saudamani offer arti to the set of Srimad Bhagavatam. And this is something that's absolutely okay to do. It's something that's encouraged to do. We should worship the Srimad Bhagavatam just as that's Krishna right there. He's sitting on our shelf, and he's just waiting to enlighten us with knowledge, right? He's waiting to show us what's the difference between substance and shadow, because we don't understand that on our own, right? And then this next sentence in the purport, another very, very important one. Thereby, so first, just to summarize, so Krishna is non-different from the Srimad Bhagavatam, right? So the Srimad Bhagavatam, we should actually worship it just as if it is him, he himself. And then thereby, we can derive the ultimate blessings of the Lord through its careful and patient study. Now, I pointed this out earlier that Srila Prabhupada, he chose these words. And this is very important for us. So it's not just through its study, it's through careful and patient study. So what this means is that, so since we are in the material world, we have material conditioning. We have our own ideas about how the world should be, how the world really is. But unfortunately, we're focusing on shadow, not substance. We haven't understood the difference yet. And so some people approach the Bhagavatam in a way that is not what we would call careful. We approach the Bhagavatam in a way where I have an idea about something, and I'm completely convinced of it, and I want to prove to everybody else that my idea is right. Therefore, I'm going to go to Srimad Bhagavatam, and I will find a quote that will support what I'm feeling about this thing. and I am going to prove to everyone else. Am I still on Zoom? Sorry, I lost the window. There I am. Sorry. And I'm going to prove to everyone else that this is the right, this is the correct, this is the correct understanding. And when we do that, when we approach Srimad Bhagavatam in that way, that's not a careful way. That is a very careless way, actually, and it's materially motivated, right? And it's an illusory way. It's not reality. If we're just trying to justify something that we believe by quoting Shastra and trying to convince others that that's the way, without understanding the actual context and without understanding the true message of the Bhagavatam through the person Bhagavatam, then we're not approaching it properly. So that's the careful part. And then there's also the patient part. Patient means Krishna, he will give us everything if we are sincere. Everything we're looking for, he will give to us if we are sincerely striving to understand it. Krishna is light, and he will shed that light on us as long as we're sincerely desiring it, and we're showing that we are sincerely desiring it. The patience comes in because we human beings, especially in the age of Kali, we tend to be fickle. We tend to change our minds quite frequently throughout the day, throughout moments. We come up with an idea and we're very attached to it, and we've made up our minds, and that's it. Nothing can convince us otherwise. This is what we're going to do. And then within a moment, we think, oh yeah, but what about this? I didn't think about that. No, we definitely can't do that then. And then all of a sudden, now this is not what we're doing, right? And this is a common thing for us. Or we get really inspired at one point. Maybe we've heard a very inspiring class, or we've attended a very inspiring kirtan, or we just studied a very inspiring passage in Bhagavatam. And anyway, so we're feeling really good about it, and so we start getting more and more serious about devotional service. But then something else comes along and distracts us from that, something from our past that we used to be attached to. And then we realize, oh, I'm actually still attached to that. And then, we see ourselves becoming distracted like that. And so the reason patient study is also there is because since we're fickle and we tend to do this, we tend to waver in our determination. We have to consistently, not just carefully, but also consistently show that we are sincere about this process. And there may be some, missteps. There may be some distractions that pull us from studying Bhagavatam. But as long as we keep pulling ourselves back to that, as long as we're patient with it and determined and steady, then that sort of study of Bhagavatam, that's what we're talking about, that will yield positive fruits. Right. So then we'll continue there. As God is all light, all bliss, and all perfection, so also is Srimad Bhagavatam. We can all have the transcendental light of the Supreme Brahman, Sri Krishna, from the recitation of Srimad Bhagavatam, provided it is received through the medium of a transparent spiritual master. So again, it's not just that, if we have the book sitting on our shelves, it's automatically going to shed light on us, and that's just how it works. It's provided we receive this knowledge through the transparent spiritual master. Now, this is very important for us to understand. That so Srila Prabhupada, he gave us very careful translations and very careful purports, and so one can argue, or one can make a case that just by reading Srila Prabhupada's translation and purports, that is coming through the transparent spiritual master being Srila Prabhupada. He is the preeminent Shiksha Guru of everyone within ISKCON. So he is our guru, our instructing spiritual master, right? And so one could make that case, and that's certainly a valid proposition. But Srila Prabhupada also emphasized the need of a Diksha Guru to actually get into the formal process, to begin the formal process of spiritual life through initiation. And also we find, and we can observe this, is that even though Srila Prabhupada's message is quite clear, if you read him regularly, his message is quite clear. But if we take some of his quotes out of context, which some people do, we see this happening, then it can seem quite confusing. We can see quotes that seem to say one thing, and then also another quote from him that seems to say the exact opposite thing. And then, there are different groups of devotees that will argue these 2 points, right? And say, well, Prabhupada said this, well, he also said this, and this was more important because this was in a book and that was just in a letter. Or, we see these arguments that are happening all the time. But what Srila Prabhupada said, what he presented to all of us, it's all truth. It is all shastric. It is all very important. And if we understand that context, then we can see that both of these points that seem to be contradictory are actually just complementary. They complete itself. So there are certain circumstances where one thing is true and certain circumstances where the other. And there's also circumstances where both are simultaneously true. And we just have to see how those two can coexist. One common thing that I've noticed with younger devotees. So just say, for example, when I was a younger devotee, I read The Science of Self-Realization, right? Great book. I love that book. It's still my favorite. This is what I recommend to anybody who's desiring to understand about spirituality. It's the first book I hand them, Science of Self-Realization. In The Science of Self-Realization, there's a excerpt from a conversation that Srila Prabhupada had with a cardinal named Cardinal Danielou, French fellow. And during that conversation, Srila Prabhupada was relentless about how Cardinal Danielou should not be saying that it's okay to eat meat. Now, Cardinal Danielou, he wanted to focus more on what his philosophy and our philosophy had in common. And one might say, well, that's cool. That's actually what we should be doing when we get together with people. We should be talking about what we have in common, right? And so one might think like that. But, Srila Prabhupada, he was very relentless. He just kept bringing it to the point where, no, you guys are sponsoring these slaughterhouses and you're saying it's okay, and that's not right? And so as a young devotee, I saw that preaching style and not understanding the context. I just thought it was okay that I could go out there and just preach like that. So any Christian I saw on the street, you shouldn't eat meat, I just drive it home, right? And and there were a lot of us that were doing it like that. We were very passionate about vegetarianism for whatever reason, right? And that became sort of like how we preached. How many Christians did you smash today? And that was like the banter that went on when we got back from our preaching. We tell the stories about it. What I found out later in life, when the Srimad Bhagavatam started showing me the difference between reality and illusion, and of course I don't understand full reality, but Srimad Bhagavatam has given me at least an idea of some things. I've understood several things through studying Srimad Bhagavatam. And what I then understand now is that the reason Srila Prabhupada was so adamant with Cardinal Danielou about vegetarianism at that particular time, it was because Cardinal Danielou, he is not just a standard Christian on the street. He is a leader of Christians. In other words, he's a teacher. He's a Christian guru. And so if he's telling his people that it's okay to eat meat, that is a problem. It's not a problem that the Christians are eating meat. That's not the problem. The problem is that their leader is telling them that it's okay. They're justifying it, and that's okay. So what I took away from it when I was younger and going out there and preaching this, hardcore vegetarianism to these poor Christians who are just, doing what their leaders are telling them to do, right? It was wrong of me to do, because that's not what Srila Prabhupada was doing. He wasn't preaching vegetarianism. He was preaching that it's not okay to be a teacher and philosophically allow your followers, your students, to deviate, and give them justification to do that. No, that's not okay. And that's what Srila Prabhupada was doing. He wasn't preaching vegetarianism. He was showing that it's not okay to mislead your followers like that with a philosophical deviation. And so we have to understand this. We have to understand context, and we have to understand not just through reading Srila Prabhupada's words and hearing his words, but also through the spiritual master. We have to have someone explain to us what's actually going on, so we don't just become vegetarian fanatics, because we're not vegetarian. We're Krishnatarian. We only eat things that are offered to Krishna. And you can only offer Krishna, it just happens to be that these are the things that he eats. So we're just consequential vegetarians. We're not vegetarians by, that's not what we are. We are Krishnites. We do whatever we do for Krishna. So it just so happens that whatever we eat, we only eat what Krishna eats, and that's what he eats. So voila. That's why we eat what we eat. And so, yeah, if we look at it one way, so that's one way to see it, right? The other way, as I mentioned, is Srila Prabhupada, when he was talking to Cardinal Danielou. Cardinal Danielou was trying to talk about their similarities. And so there may be people that would criticize Srila Prabhupada because, well, why didn't he just go ahead and talk about the similarities? And then that could build a bridge between the Christians and the non-Christians, right? And that's also a semi-valid point, but not in that context, right? So for us, when we meet Christians on the street, that's what we should do. We should talk about our similarities, right? And that's what Srila Prabhupada did. When he had disciples, or not, they weren't disciples yet, when he had people come to him and ask him about what are you talking about? What is spirituality? First thing he would say is, well, whatever religion you are, chant God's names. So whatever you call him, if you're a Muslim, you call him Allah. If, Christians, sometimes they call him Yahweh. There's different names in the Bible, or whatever name you're familiar with, you chant that. And then when they'd come around for a little longer, and they'd be like, well, I want to learn about your philosophy. And you say, okay, well then chant these names. So then they're chanting Hare Krishna, right? And then they're chanting Hare Krishna in the park, and then they want to become his disciples. So then he says, oh, by the way, these are four regular principles. We don't eat meat. We don't take intoxications, we don't have illicit sex, and we don't gamble. And they were like, oh, okay. So the first thing was all about chanting, and it was all about the similarities and like that. So in general, that's what we do. But we have to see that in that context, Srila Prabhupada had to be heavy with Cardinal Danielou because he was misguiding his followers, and that's what he was focusing on. So we have to be able to see beyond the details of what's going on. The details was Srila Prabhupada was talking about Cardinal Danielou about vegetarianism. But the principle was, the reason he was talking about that at that time was because the principle of maintaining your philosophy, not changing it to satisfy others, that is more important. And so that's what Srila Prabhupada was talking about. So so that the cardinal would stop misguiding his followers. He didn't want to talk about what they had in common, because fundamentally you're already leading your followers astray. So he wanted to deal with that. But when we deal with just standard, if they're not leaders like that, if they don't have followers, then it's not their fault. They're just doing what their leaders are telling them to. So we talk about what we have in common, right? Then they can relate to it, and then they can understand, oh, well, actually, yeah, maybe our leaders aren't really giving us the full deal, because when I read the Bible, I see that there are things in there that don't necessarily gel with what's going on in the world right now. And so that's a more natural way. And so when we see this, when we understand the details and principles, or the reality distinguished from illusion, when I say the detail and principle, this is actually what it means. The principle is the reality, right? And the detail, since it's a reflection, or since it's a projection of that reality, it can look a lot like reality, and we think it's real. We think the detail is actually the thing, right? And so we become fanatic vegetarians, for example, or or fanatic, anything. If we're just focused on that detail and we don't understand where it comes from, what the actual substance was that showed us what, to do this detail. It's not that we stop doing the detail, it's that we understand why we're doing the detail, right? Understand that. So that's when I talk about principle and detail. This is what I'm always talking about. And so, and this is the purpose of Srimad Bhagavatam. It looks like I'm starting to go a little over time, but I want to wrap this up first. So just to drive that point home, that this is the reason why the person Bhagavatam, so Srila Prabhupada goes on to talk about how Srila Swarup Damodar, Lord Chaitanya's secretary, when people would come to meet in Puri, they'd come from Navadvip, and they'd come from Kumarahata, they'd come from all different places to visit Lord Chaitanya in Puri when he stayed there. And he would encourage them that you have to understand the Bhagavatam, the book Bhagavatam, from a person Bhagavatam, someone who understands it and can present it to you well. Swarup Damodar Goswami would also, if devotees would come and they would want to make a presentation to Lord Chaitanya, whether it was a play or a drama or a poem like that, they would first present it to Srila Swarup Damodar because he understood the philosophy completely. And even if, there was one example of this Bengali poet, very well-meaning, well-intentioned, he had good intentions, but the way he worded his play, he was talking about how there's Lord Jagannath there, and he's stationary, and then there's Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, and he's moving, and he was comparing them, it's good because they're both the same person, just like we were learning about the Srimad Bhagavatam is non-different. But the way he worded it, it was actually impersonal, had impersonal undertones, and so that it wasn't good to present to the devotees. So Swarup Damodar wanted to make sure that he understood that, the principle of what you're doing, it's not quite understood yet. And therefore you may confuse people. So then eventually Swarup Damodar explained, okay, well, if you just switch this and this, and then you look at it in this way, then what you presented is actually okay. But he would always make sure that people understood. So hearing Srimad Bhagavatam from a person who understands Bhagavatam, from a bona fide spiritual master, whether it's your Diksha Guru or Shiksha Gurus who understand Srimad Bhagavatam properly, that is very important. So just to close, there's 3 points I want to make. The first one, this is just a sentence from the purport, that Srimad Bhagavatam is the literary incarnation of God and is therefore non-different from him, right? That's one thing that we have to remember. Srimad Bhagavatam is non-different from Krishna. The second thing is that it is meant for the ultimate goal of all people, right? This is what it is. And again, that was from 1:1:2, we understood that the reason that it's meant for the ultimate good of all people is because it distinguishes reality from illusion, or substance and shadow. And then the third point I want to make is that if we wish to understand and serve Krishna and reawaken that eternal relationship we have with him, it is in our best interest to worship the Srimad Bhagavatam, and as Srila Prabhupada worded it in his purport, carefully and patiently study the Srimad Bhagavatam. Again, carefully meaning that we want to understand what the context is. We don't want to approach it trying to justify something that we already have in our head. We want to go to it and understand what should be in our head, right? We don't want to go to it with any preconceived notions. We want to approach it and receive its knowledge. We don't want to try to, take out exactly what we're looking for. No, we want to receive the knowledge. So careful and patient. This is how we should study Srimad Bhagavatam. And we should worship it just as we worship Krishna. Okay, I'm going to stop there because I went further than I should have time-wise. So let's see if there are any questions or comments or corrections or additions or reflections, anything like that. Is there anything?
Anyone has questions, you can raise your hands or ask directly. So far, I don't see anybody's.
Real quick, I just also wanted to mention Caruchandra Prabhu. We have with us today His Grace Tatvavit Prabhu. Tatvavit Prabhu, disciple of his Divine Grace Srila Prabhupada. He's also an editor and writer. I'm not sure if you know him or not. But editor, worked he lived in Philadelphia from 80 to 86, worked as an editor for the BTG, worked for the BBT and other, scholarly ISKCON publications.
Thank you. I'm in Philadelphia, Caruchandra. I'm here in Philadelphia.
You made it. Good. Yeah, I was just talking with Tatvavit Prabhu.
You were okay. I'm sorry.
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah, no, we met in Mayapur actually, during a Bhakti Vaibhav course, and we spent some time in Mayapur together, and we were very recently talking. It's good to see you, Prabhu, on here. I didn't notice your name there.
Hare Krishna, Prabhuji.
Yes.
Very nice class. I really liked when he said that we should have in our mind a good thing, not we should do what our mind thinks. And our question is, how can we be consistent in our bhakti when we are surrounded by a lot of people that don't believe in that philosophy and they get distracted? And how can we be consistent then? How can we be focused?
That's a great question, and thank you for asking that. So this is why it's important for us to, whenever possible, take advantage of the association of devotees. Now, in our lives, we may find ourselves, we have different jobs, things like that, different situations, and we can find ourselves surrounded by non-devotees. And it's in our best interest to, whenever possible, to take advantage of the association of devotees, and also to sort of try to develop that. We have, me for example, I have this inner voice in my head that it tells me, what's right, what's wrong. When I was younger, my inner voice, it was of, different movies that I've seen. They're just different knowledge that I've acquired from different, some things were funny, some things were inspirational, some things were, like that. But what I had in my head were these different, comedians and inspirational speakers that would, sort of, like that. And even after I started cultivating Krishna consciousness, or trying to cultivate Krishna consciousness, those were still in my head, those comedians and the inspirational speakers. And I regretted that for a while because, we have the Srimad Bhagavatam, like I said, neither from Krishna. He's there up on our shelves. And even though for, like a decade, I had that volume of books sitting on my shelf and I had access to that, to Krishna, I had access to being able to distinguish what was actually reality and what was illusion. I still had these, these mundane comedians and mundane inspirational speakers in my head, and I'd be quoting them, and this is how it would be, and I thought that was greatly unfortunate. But the deal was, it was because I didn't really study Srimad Bhagavatam at the time. I had it, I respected it, I listened to classes from time to time, but I didn't really study. I didn't make it part of my life. I wasn't doing that yet. Once I started doing that, I found that those inner voices, some of those comedians and mundane inspirational speakers started taking a back seat. And what I was beginning to hear was Srila Prabhupada's voice, because we can hear his recordings, and we can actually, once we are used to his voice, when we're reading, we also hear his voice when he's, it's almost as if he's reading to us out loud. When we read his words, we can hear his voice. And so sometimes it's his voice, and he's just, it's passages that I've read before, in my head. And sometimes it's my guru's voice, different conversations that we've had. And so when we do this, when we practice devotional service, again, carefully and patiently, and we begin to understand how to distinguish reality from illusion based on the Srimad Bhagavatam and based on the person Bhagavatam, then what we'll find is even if we're surrounded by a bunch of other kinds of people, we have enough in our head that drives us in the correct direction. Now, eventually, of course, we want to put ourselves in a situation where we are only surrounded by devotees, so then we can, really just full-time cultivate Krishna consciousness. We can learn off one another. We can, share realizations, learn from each other's past experiences, whether they're successes or failures, like that. These are all very important things. But in the meantime, if we're in a spot where we can't always be surrounded by devotees, we should at least, whenever possible, take advantage of the association and also read Shastra as much as possible, patiently and carefully study Shastra. And when we do these things, again, that track in our mind, it just switches from this mundane junk that we're used to, good, solid, clean, Krishna conscious instruction. And that's what we're trying to do. Did that answer your question?
Yes, very nice, very helpful. Thank you very much, Prabhuji.
Sure. Yeah, like I said, ideally, we also want to try to just cut out the bad association and accept the good. But until then, this is a tool that we can use.
Okay, thank you.
Oh,
Hare
thank you.
Krishna, Prabhu.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you for such a wonderful class. Thank you. Prabhuji, you mentioned like 3 points at last. So I got 2 points, but I missed the first one. Would you please repeat that one?
The first point. Okay, so the first point was it was a sentence from the purport. And it is this. It is that Srimad Bhagavatam is the literary incarnation of God and is therefore non-different from him. So that's
Okay.
So if we remember that Krishna is non-different from Srimad Bhagavatam, so obviously if we want to know Krishna, which is the goal of all Vaishnavas, that's what we should focus on. We should read the pastimes of Srimad Bhagavatam. The second one, I'll just say all three of them because why not? The second one was that it's meant for the ultimate good of all people, and the reason it does that is because it distinguishes reality from illusion. And then the third one is that if we wish to see, understand and serve Krishna, which all aspiring Vaishnavas do, and to reawaken that eternal position, it is in our best interest to worship and carefully and patiently study Srimad Bhagavatam. And this is something that we should always have in our head. And this should be top priority for devotees. It's we should make sure we chant our japa and fulfill our promises to our spiritual master. And on top of that, we should be worshiping and studying Srimad Bhagavatam. And then also Sri Chaitanya Charitamrita, because then we learned, like today's purport referred to Chaitanya Charitamrita, Swarup Damodar, how he would make sure that everyone was receiving Bhagavatam from a bona fide source and not in any way misunderstanding it. Again, reality distinguished from illusion for the welfare of all. It's within our best interest to, as often as possible, study carefully and patiently Srimad Bhagavatam.
Thank you so much, Prabhuji.
Thank you. Another thing I'll point out, if there aren't any other questions, it's something I was going to put in the class and I kind of forgot, was that there are. So I pointed out earlier that Srila Prabhupada, for example, that word vastu in 112, and Srila Prabhupada expanded that to distinguishing reality from illusion. And just instead of just saying, Srimad Bhagavatam gives you substance, right? There are some Sanskritists out there these days, and they claim to give a more literal translation of verses from Bhagavad Gita, Srimad Bhagavatam, whatever, and they'll sort of just give like, you know, a scholarly translation of what these verses are. And sometimes if the intention, it depends on what the intention is there, but sometimes we don't get the full picture from that. Like I said, when Srila Prabhupada presented this to us, he did it very carefully. Srila Prabhupada understands the entire Siddhanta, and when he sees something and he sees that something could be misunderstood, he will elaborate on it, whether it's in a translation or in a purport. And that's what acharyas do. That's what they're meant to do. So some Sanskritists claim that Srila Prabhupada, you know, maybe he was taking too many liberties. That's what some claim like that. And so we have to be wary of these, because I've seen that some devotees fall for this too. They see a scholar that understands Sanskrit and they say, well, look, this is the actual meaning, and they can be misled. We want to make sure that that doesn't happen with us. We want to make sure, like today's verse says, we want to learn Bhagavatam from the person Bhagavatam. And Srila Prabhupada understood Bhagavatam, absolutely 100%, no question about it. And he presented it to us in a way that we would not get confused. Like Srila Vyasadeva, he wanted to make sure no one would get confused. So he presented it in a very particular way. And that's what Srila Prabhupada did for us. And so we should be very careful if we hear people trying to claim that you know, maybe they know Sanskrit better than Srila Prabhupada, they understand it better, and they're trying to give a different perspective of how we should understand these things. We should be careful of what the motives are on those people, because a lot of times the motive isn't good. Now, if we're just trying to expand, like so, Srila Vishwanath Chakrabarti Thakur, for example, he'll take a Sanskrit phrase and he'll explain it in many different ways. You know, like sometimes a demon will be insulting Krishna, right? He's talking about how he's debauchee and he's a coward, and you know, they're trying to insult Krishna in so many ways. And then Srila Vishwanath Chakrabarti Thakur, he says, well, actually, you know, his words were inspired by Saraswati, the goddess of learning, because even though he meant to say this, in Sanskrit, it actually also means this way, and he's just actually glorifying Krishna in so many different ways, right? And so Srila Vishwanath Chakrabarti Thakur will like point these things out. So it's not that it's bad to give very different variations of what Sanskrit means, but it's the intention. So Srila Vishwanath Chakrabarti Thakur, his intention was to glorify Krishna. He could do that, that's fine. But we hear Srila Prabhupada talk about these word jugglerists, you know, the people that do word jugglery and word wranglers, and they try to spew out different meanings of verses. That's the thing that we want to be careful of. We want to make sure that we're not being fed an alternate version of the Siddhanta, you know, in this thing. So it's not that I'm not trying to say that Sanskrit scholars don't know what they're talking about. Obviously, that's not what I'm trying to say. Well, I hope that's obvious. But we should be careful to understand, you know, where all this is coming from. And so if we do study Srimad Bhagavatam regularly, we will be able to understand when people start doing this and trying to explain something to us, we'll understand if they're actually explaining it according to the Siddhanta, or if they're, you know, trying to sort of, you know, sway us in a different way for whatever reason, political or personal or whatever. So that's one thing I wanted to point out, since today I did point out that in these verses sometimes Srila Prabhupada will expand it to show us exactly what he's talking about, because otherwise, like I said, the verse 112, if we just talked about substance, even though in the English word, you know, substance implies that it's the real thing, not the thing that's projected from it. But not everybody understands that completely. And so it's an important thing to understand. And it's also verified throughout Srimad Bhagavatam. So Srila Prabhupada put it in there to just expand that definition so we didn't misunderstand it, right? So that's there. So I just wanted to point that out, that Srila Prabhupada does this for our benefit, and we have to make sure that anyone else that's trying to do such a thing is actually doing it for the benefit of serving Bhagavatam's purpose, or if they're doing it for personal reasons like that. Is there anything else?
I don't see any more hands. Let's see. Here. Bob just mentions in the chat, thank you very much for a great class. Thank you, Caruchandra Prabhu. It's very, very, very nice, again, to just immerse ourselves. Very important verse, one I guess that we should reflect upon more and more. Wish everybody to have a wonderful Krishna conscious day, and we'll continue tomorrow. Tomorrow we have Vishnu Gada Prabhu, and he'll be going through the Chaitanya Charitamrita. Real quick, Chaitanya Caruchandra Prabhu. On Saturday, I don't know if you remember this devotee, but he came through Philadelphia back in the 90s. There was a devotee, Krishna Kirtan.
Yeah.
He was a Chinese body devotee. Yeah. He came to the temple on Saturday.
Nice.
He was asking about you, how you doing.
I saw him a few years ago at New York Rath Yatra, 4 or 5 years ago. He's great. It's actually Krishnot Kirtana, Ut Kirtana. We say Krishna Kirtana. But yeah, he's a disciple of Tamal Krishna Goswami. And his name is perfect because I don't know if you remember when he was living there. He was living in the Brahmachari ashram, and he was going to, I think it was Temple University. But he chanted so loud, his japa, he chanted so loud, and that's what Krishnot Kirtana means, is loudly chanting Krishna's names. So he had the perfect name from Tamal Krishna Goswami.
Yeah. Thank you, Prabhu.
Thank you.
Thank you, Prabhu. Thank you.
Grantaraj, Srimad Bhagavatam ki
Jai.
Prabhupada ki jai.
Jai. Pacitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavibhyo Namo
Namo Namaha. Go.